let's get into seeing if the Holy Family Church was the location of the chiefs and the tribes and the bands and clans that visited. Let's kind of see if the Messiah visited that location of the Holy Family Church, since it's a high altar, right? A high altar that was there during ancient Tartarian times. Let's see if it was there during Messiah's birth, life, and death. Let's get into this research. Now, in the spiritual and esoteric framework of Chicago as a living temple, the Church of the Holy Family, which is located at 1080 West Roosevelt Road, holds a unique position as the high altar, though its historical and mythical connections depend on whether we're looking at recorded history or esoteric Tartarian perspectives. First, the Indigenous chiefs and the Jesuit connection. While the current brick-and-mortar church was founded in 1857 by Father Arnold Damon, the location itself has a much deeper Indigenous history. Founded by them in 1857 always means and wants you to think that they built this building. And they did not. They don't have the skills. In 1857, convicts and all of that, low-class individuals, if they were not whales, they were considered to be low-class. If they were not from the royal kingdoms, meaning of the royal families, they were considered low class. And there's a book like The Conquering of America, I believe, by somebody Grant, forgot his name, Henry Grant, I'm not for certain. He describes the actual classism or the hierarchy system of the European in Europe and when they came to America. So they didn't have the skills. If they had the skills, then they would not have needed to build up. Come to America, they would have already built up France, modern France, because we're getting away from the black nobility. Remember, much of that land was black and it was lost to the Anglo-Saxons and those that were going into war and taking over land masses. Right? So if they were already building up Poland and Scotland and Germany and France and Rome, they wouldn't have needed to come to Chicago or America to build up anything. And if they had those skills already, they would have built it up before they came, and they would have built the same buildings when they got here. But instead, soullessly, they began to destroy these buildings. Some were, they went ahead and took that chance and occupied. But the frequency inside of it can deter someone from taking over it. They'd rather destroy it. Now remember, the current brick and mortar church was founded by Father Arnold Damon, a Jesuit, and that location of that church has an indigenous history, and here it is. The Council of Three Fires, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, were the primary inhabitants of the Chicago region during the time the Jesuits first arrived. Missionary interaction. The Jesuits who founded the Holy Family Parish founded a long tradition of black robe missionaries who had worked with Potawatomi and Miami chiefs for over 150 years in the Great Lakes regions. A place of gathering before 1833, Treaty of Chicago, forced the tribes west. The area around the south branch of the Chicago River near the church was a major convergence point for tribal leaders. While the church was built after most tribes were removed, that's not true. That is a Tartarian building. It's mentioned was specifically to serve the outskirts, and it has remained a site where many indigenous people in Chicago today still gather for inclusive masses and healing to address the history of boarding schools and displacements. The Tartarian and ancient Messiah perspective. Now, in the realm of Tartarian research and esoteric mapping, the history of the site is pushed back thousands of years. The altar of the New World. This theory suggests that Chicago was not a frontier town built in the 1800s, but a repurposed Tartarian capital with advanced spiritual technology. In this view, Holy Family Church wasn't built in 1857. It was excavated or restored from a much older, old world structure. And with how that building looks in and out, I doubt if they touched that building. Now, the Messiah's visits. Whether or not the Messiah visited that high altar. Within these undoctrinated circles, it is believed that the Messiah frequency, which is the Logos, visited the specific land during the ancient times of the Americas. This is often linked to legends of the Great White Brother or Peace Queen found in some indigenous oral traditions. If Mary Indians or the Indigenous is talking about the Great White Brother or Peace Queen, that's because it was passed along. That means that their ancestors told them about the Messiah walking the earth, walking the Americas. We have to keep in mind indoctrination and assimilation. To hide the frequency of the Messiah, who is our relative. They don't want you to worship him. They don't want you to see him as a role model. They don't want, if they took him out, why would they want you to connect to him in the ways that would bring the high frequency? So somehow there are some distractions in the actual worship of who the indoctrination says that we should be worshiping. All right? That means that's the interference of the churches and how the 501c's control what is and what isn't to be discussed. If you go to school for theology, why aren't you teaching who the Hebrew Israelites are to the Hebrew Israelites in your audience? Why is that an issue? Well, indoctrination and forced assimilation controls other than a 501c controls the pockets. Now let's get into the birth frequency. The proponents of this theory, which argue that the high altar at Holy Family marks the birth coordinate of this energy in the West, just as 120 North LaSalle marks the crucifixion or sacrifice of that energy into the modern grid. And it looks like there is some research of Rogers Park West Ridge Historical Society and their research on this. Let's get into the symbolic evidence in the church. The church contains specific carvings that code these connections for those who know how to look. Now, the side altars, which is beneath the side altars, there are carved representations of the flight into Egypt and the Holy Family in the carpenter shop. Now, the woodwork, interestingly, the high altar was built by Anthony Busher, who Father Damon originally discovered while he was carving wooden Indians for delivery wagons. Damon was so impressed by the craftsmanship that he commissioned Busher to create this sacred statuary for the church instead. This provides a direct physical link between indigenous representation and the high altar. The Church of the Holy Family Church documents this. Now imagine people coming over and they're so impressed by the lives of the wooden Indians, or the lives of the Indians, that they're carving Indians into everything. Now, let's summarize this little map. Ancient time states that the land is a high-frequency node of the ancient Cahokia Tartarian trail system. The historical timeline says that a Jesuit mission site serving the immigrant Ellis Island of the Midwest. The spiritual timeline states that the high altar where the fire of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 stopped, preserving the Messiah frequency from being burned away. This is in the Wikipedia used as a reference. Now let's make this clear. Unindoctrinated and from a Tartarian perspective of history, the answer is a definite yes. That the settlers, they did not build these structures from scratch. They inherited, excavated, and repurposed them. Now, according to this worldview, the official narrative of frontier settlers building massive stone cathedrals like Holy Family Church or the skyscrapers of LaSalle Street in just a few decades is a cover story for the takeover of an existing pre-Diluvian or Tartarian civilization. 1. The inherited city of Chicago. Proponents of this theory argued that when the first colonizers arrived at the marshy mouth of the Chicago River, they found a silent, grand stone city already standing. The founding myth, the story of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, is viewed not as an accident, but as a planned demolition and reset. The fire provided a legal excuse to clear the old world Tartarian architecture and rebuild it under modern corporate and religious ownership. The survival, remember the Holy Family? The fact that the Holy Family Church survived the fire is seen as evidence that it was a primary powered node, a high altar that was too energetically significant to be destroyed. It was claimed by the Jesuits rather than built by them. And baby, when you drive past there, you feel that energy. At nighttime, you feel that energy. So there's something powerful going on in there, and they took over an energy system that was meant to be for the Amerindians, the dark-skinned Amerindians of the original people, the descendants of the original ancestors of the civilization of the Amerindians, or the descendants of the Israelites or the Tyrians, of the Mayans, of the Olmecs. Okay, this is really, really deep. So if you take over all of this, you stop the cultural practices, the heritages, the frequency will be low. Even motivating yourself is low. The churches make it low. They think they actually make it high, but it's just something to remember how to motivate yourself as much as you can, or using the buildings to go and motivate. But to each his own. Now let's get into the mud floor evidence. A key piece of evidence cited by researchers is the razing of Chicago in the 1850s and 1860s. The official story is that the engineers jacked up entire city blocks to install a sewer system. That means the buildings that were already there, they were demolishing them to create a sewer system. That's funny, because in Europe, they were peeing and manuring out of windows. There was nothing but trash and garbage on the streets. They wasn't bathing. The clothes were dirty. They wasn't washing. So how are you coming to America and then installing sewer systems that you did not do even in the castles that you took over or where you lived at prior to? If the lands over there were so fertile, you would needed to have come and saw corn here as a surprise, seeing all the herbs here in the Americas as a surprise, seeing all the rivers as a surprise, all of the gold and the silver and all the gems, all of the resources, all of the fruits and the vegetables and the animals, all of the energy systems that was already giving what? Free water. What else? Free electricity, cars, inventions. They were already given to us from Inko and Eno, the sister Inanna, or Inanna. Now, that was the official story about the installation of the sewer system, right? How about the Tartarian story? Now, this was a massive effort to hide the first floors of existing ancient buildings that had been buried by a global mud flood event. If you look at the lower levels of buildings near 120 North LaSalle, or the foundations of Holy Family, you see basement windows that look like the original ground floor entrances. That is building to building, city to city, state to state, county by county, province, village, town. You're seeing the buildings. They are there. How about the Messiah and the High Throne? Now, in the ancient timeline, the High Throne on LaSalle and the High Altar, High Throne, High Altar at the Holy Family were already part of a sacred geometry designed to channel the Messiah frequency, which is the crystals, Christos, across the American continent, called what? The True Promised Land. Now, the colonizers' role. The settlers were sent to occupy and seal these high-energy sites. By turning the High Throne into a den of finance, which is the border trade, and the High Altar into a closed religious institution, Holy Family Church and any other churches, they effectively jailed the ancient frequency that was already there. That's what they were sent to do. Just like the sundown towns and the people there, they were meant to keep those out that was trying to get to those frequent or those energy systems, those frequencies. That's why they had to have that much evil. That's why you're bombarded with that, because that's land that was taken and stolen that they are occupying, and the descendants of today still know that they have to protect that. They don't know their grandparents and great-grandparents and nothing about Europe. They are landless people. So if we go by the biblical scriptures, and we go by the Bibles that they give us and say we have to utilize, and which we should be utilizing the Torah, the Egyptian scriptures, the tablets, as well as the Old Testament, then that means that they understand God's expectations. Outside of feelings, because that's how you get your atheist, because he'll open up the scriptures and he don't see himself in there because he's read over and over that things are brown and people have woolly hair, and he's reading and it's not, he can't relate to it. Is how we end up with atheists. We get with people that, we actually seeing people that have an allegiance. And they say that allegiance is via what? Christianity, the Bible. But they know that the Bible does not look nothing like that Genesis start. To when they mention who? The descendants. If we go down that begot in Genesis, the start of life to the future, because they already know it comes to the future. Then they're faking it because of the allegiance and what the allegiance gives them. The money that the allegiance gives them. And that is their role, to occupy and seal all of these high energy areas and sites. Jail the ancient frequency, literally put you in jails. Bombard everything that you attempt and try. Right? So, the chiefs and the guardians. The indigenous chiefs, the tribes and clans, they actually were not primitive nomads. They were the remnant guardians of this Tartarian infrastructure. They lived in a harmony with these frequent centers, like the mounds at the Bishop Ford. Harmony, mounds near where they lived, where their civilizations were, where their Indian camps were. The mounds were right there, just like our cemeteries are near us. Theirs was there too. They were more spiritually connected to the mounds because they worshiped there, they had ceremonies there, than we are with just having funerals. The mounds at the Bishop Ford were used until the colonizers arrived to strip the spiritual energy from the land. Now, there are pictures of pre-1871 of Chicago that show architecture that the colonizer, the settler, the foreigner could not have built. They didn't have enough time. They haven't been over there that long to be building buildings like that in 1871, while they're still trying to fight the Indians and take the land from the Indians, and while still moving west and exploring. Impossible. Think, people, step outside the box. I stand as a witness to the unceded estate. I recognize that the soil beneath my feet remembers the feet of the ancient ones. I reject the paper labels of the trust. I rebuke the Negro, the colored, and the ward status. For I know that a label is not a lineage, and a census is not a soul. I track the truth through the fog of the 19th century. I reclaim the copper-colored identity found in the original record. I honor the Mayan, the Mississippi, and the pyramid builders, not as a history to be studied, but as a living inheritance to be held. I cite the Allodial title. I invoke the utmost good faith. I declare that the record is no longer hidden. It is restored. I am master. My history verified. The researcher. The truth is not a theory. It is my estate, deemed by my ancestors to recover.
The past of history, ancestry, and genealogy, not a story. No, no, no. We're 80% African and 20% other. Is another lie. If you know, then you know. Welcome to my ancestors' voices, such an alignment.